This is Hybrid Cognition, a narrated version of my Substack essays and field notes on AI, organizations, leadership, governance, and institutional change. The original article, related notes, and any companion tools are linked in the description. Over the last year, I found myself returning to one idea again and again. It sounds simple at first. Human cognition is no longer exclusively human. But the more I think about it, the less it feels like a technological observation and the more it feels like a conceptual disturbance. Because if that sentence is even partly true, then many of our assumptions about leadership, strategy, organizations, authority, and accountability begin to wobble. Not collapse, but wobble. For most of modern organizational life, we have assumed that cognition sits inside human beings. Managers think, executives decide, boards deliberate, experts analyze, leaders judge. Tools may support these processes. They may store information, calculate faster, or automate routine tasks. But the actual reasoning, the interpretation, the judgment, the authorships of decisions, that has been treated as human. That assumption has shaped how we think about organizations. Leadership theory assumes that authority is tied to human expertise, experience, and judgment. Strategy theory assumes that decision makers operate under human cognitive limits. Limited information, limited attention, limited processing capability. Governance assumes that responsibility can ultimately be traced to an identifiable people. Institutional legitimacy assumes that decisions can be justified through intelligible human reasoning. Those assumptions made sense, of course. They were built in a world where reasoning and judgment were inseparable from human actors. But that boundary conditioning is changing. And this is where hybrid cognition begins. Today, reasoning systems are no longer just storing data or executing predefined instructions, but rather they are generating analysis, they are producing recommendations, they are assessing risk, they are ranking options, they are filtering candidates, they are flagging regulatory exposure, they are summarizing strategic alternatives before decision makers even enter the room. That does not mean that machines are people. It doesn't mean that AI systems have intention, responsibility, morality, or agency in the human sense. That's not the argument I'm making. The argument is more practical. If non-human systems meaningfully shape institutional decisions, then cognition inside organizations is no longer exclusively human. It has become distributed. And that changes the question. The important question is not whether machines are really intelligent in some philosophical sense. The important question is whether they participate in the reasoning processes through which organizations act. And increasingly, they do. Think about a normal executive decision process. A leadership team sits down to discuss a pricing change, a hiring decision, a capital allocation question, a risk exposure, or a strategic initiative. On the surface, it still looks like a human process. People read materials, they ask questions, they debate trade-offs. Eventually, someone makes a decision. But before that meeting even begins, something else has already happened. A forecasting system may have shaped the scenarios under discussion. A risk model may have filtered the acceptable options. A compliance system may have constrained the available pathways. A generative tool may have summarized the background material. A recommendation engine may have ranked alternatives in a particular order. By the time humans start deliberating, the field of possible choices has already been structured. The human decision is still real, but it is no longer produced alone. That is what I mean by hybrid cognition. A decision can remain formally human while becoming cognitively hybrid. And once we see that, several familiar concepts become unstable. The first is agency. In traditional organizational thinking, agency is usually attached to people. A person acts, a manager decides, a committee approves, a board is accountable. But in hybrid cognition, Influence does not always follow the same path as formal accountability. A system may shape what information is visible. It may determine which risks are emphasized. It may generate the options that are being considered. It may recommend one pathway over another. It may make some choices appear obvious and others almost invisible. Yet the accountability remains attached to the human executive, the committee, the organization. So influence spreads across the system while accountability remains formally human. That creates a gap. Not necessarily a legal gap at first, but a conceptual and an institutional one. Who actually authored the decision? Who shaped the alternatives? Who defined the problem? Who set the thresholds? Who selected the model? Who decided when the system should be trusted? And who is responsible when the outcome is challenged? These questions are not theoretical edge cases. They are already present in organizations that use advanced analytics, AI assistants, automated scoring systems, and generative tools in meaningful decision processes. The second question that changes is authority. For a long time, leadership authority has rested partly on the idea of superior human judgment. The leader is the person who sees patterns that others miss. The senior expert is the person who can interpret complexity. The executive is the person who can synthesize uncertain information into direction. But what happens when analytical capacity is partially externalized into systems? What happens when a model processes more data than any individual can read? What happens when a generative system proposes a strategic framing that no one in the room would have produced unaided? What happens when a first draft of reasoning comes from outside human cognition? Leadership doesn't disappear, but the basis of authority changes. Authority can no longer rest only on being the most analytically capable person in the room. Increasingly, it has to rest on something else. The ability to design, interpret, govern, and justify the systems through which reasoning happens. In other words, leadership authority shifts from personal cognitive dominance toward decision architecture. The leader is no longer simply the person who makes the call. The leader is also responsible for the conditions under which the call is produced. That includes which systems are used, how their outputs enter deliberation, where human judgment sits, how disagreement is handled, and how the final decision can be explained. This is not a smaller form of leadership. It may become a more demanding one. The third concept that changes is legitimacy. In human exclusive systems, legitimacy depends on recognizable human reasoning. A decision is legitimate because the right people considered the right information through the right process. But in hybrid systems, legitimacy also depends on the systems involved. Can the recommendation be explained? Can the model be questioned? Can the data be traced? Can a human override the output? Can disagreement be recorded? Can responsibility be assigned in a way that reflects how influence actually flowed? If the answer is no, then legitimacy becomes fragile. An organization may still have formal authority, it may still have roles, committees, policies, and sign-offs, but if the actual reasoning process is opaque, distributed, or poorly governed, then the legitimacy of the decision can fracture when challenged. This is why AI governance cannot be treated as a peripheral compliance exercise. Under hybrid cognition, governance becomes part of institutional identity. It's not just bureaucracy layered onto strategy. It's part of what makes authority credible. This may be one of the most important shifts. In the old model, governance often sat outside the decision. It constrained human action from the outside. Under hybrid cognition, governance sits inside the decision process itself. It shapes which systems are used, how recommendations are produced, how outputs are interpreted, and how responsibility is distributed. That means governance is not merely a control function, it becomes identity infrastructure. It tells others what kind of institution this actually is. Can it explain its decisions? Can it contest its own systems? Can it preserve human responsibility without pretending that reasoning is still exclusively human? These are not technical questions only. They are questions about institutional trust. At a practical level, the implications are uncomfortable. If your decisions are co-produced by systems you cannot fully explain, your authority changes. If your accountability structures still assume human exclusive reasoning while your decision processes are hybrid, responsibility will diffuse under pressure. If your governance is mostly symbolic, legitimacy may fracture when outcomes are challenged. If leadership identity remains tied only to personal expertise, while strategic reasoning is distributed across systems, leaders may misunderstand the forces shaping their own choices. But this is not an argument against AI, and it is not an argument for slowing everything down until perfect governance exists. Hybrid cognition does not diminish the importance of human judgment. It raises the bar for how that judgment is positioned. The task is not to resist hybrid cognition, it is to understand what changes when reasoning becomes distributed. Because if reasoning is no longer exclusively human, then leadership, organization, strategy, accountability, and governance have to be reinterpreted under new conditions. That is the starting point of this project. Hybrid cognition is not a claim that machines have become human. It is a claim that institutional reasoning has become structurally hybrid. And once that happens, the old question, who made the decision, is no longer enough. We also have to ask, who shaped the options? Who structured the reasoning? Who designed the system? Who governs the architecture? And can the institution still explain why the decision is legitimate? That is where the real work begins. If you want to read the original essay, follow the links in the description. I've also included any related field notes, companion tools, and references there. Thanks for listening.